All right, in Standard 13B, it's asking you to examine and explain the roles of women in the reform movements. And then we'll look at Standard 13C. Okay, so if we're looking at women, okay, women during the time of reform in the progressive era are receiving considerable education at this point. And let's be very specific. It's middle-class women that are receiving this education. Women are still seen as the nurturers, okay, of the family. It says in the PowerPoint, agents of stability, meaning like you could always depend on the fact that the woman was at home, and she was taking care of the household and she was taking care of the children, okay? This also gave women the opportunity to use their influence to advocate for social change. They're the ones watching the children. They have a good idea of what those children will need. Okay. All right. Let's look at your first one. Again, what's in purple/pink is your vocab, and what's in yellow is what you need to be writing down. Jane Addams was a huge influencer when it came to women during the time of reform. She was very concerned about the poor and immigrant women and children because a lot of times they were neglected and they didn't really have a voice. She founded what was called the Settlement House movement, and it was basically an establishment where she was able to get donations from the wealthy in society, and she would use it to build this house, this home or this location for immigrant women and children to come, and they could get an education. They could learn about society. They could learn to adapt. She did this in Chicago. And she also created what was called the Whole House. This is all part of the Settlement House movement, okay, where women could come and settle and live and learn and grow and become Americans, okay? And in 1889, her Whole House, just keep this in mind, served over 2,000 clients of the poor by educating them. She also went to members, legislative members, leaders in the government, to get their assistance to help the poor immigrants, okay, to make sure that they could adjust and acclimate to society. She's also going to become part of the women's suffrage movement and a member of the NAACP, okay? And the NAACP is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Let's look at C, and it says just to connect the decision of Plessy versus Ferguson to the expansion of Jim Crow laws and the formation of the NAACP. So really, look at Plessy versus Ferguson, and we'll kind of talk about this Supreme Court case. And how did it expand Jim Crow laws? Remember, we talked about after the Civil War, the time of Reconstruction, where whites are using poll taxes and literacy tests to keep blacks from voting, to keep them out of elections and things like that. And to kind of segregate them away from the rest of society. Well, Plessy versus Ferguson is a Supreme Court case that once that decision is passed, is going to solidify Jim Crow and almost make those laws legal. Okay? So let's kind of that. Jim Crow laws, again, they're not new. We had talked about them after the Civil War during the time of Reconstruction. And remember, Confederate states used those Jim Crow laws. They had created laws to keep blacks separate from whites. Okay, the initial purpose was to keep them from participating in the political process. If they're not voting, then they don't get a say in society. They don't get a say in politics, and nothing will change for them. Okay. Jim Crow laws were provided to maintain this separate but equal facilities, but black facilities were far inferior, meaning just because something's separate doesn't make it equal. They didn't have the same facilities. They didn't have the same equipment. They didn't have the same resources to make those facilities function well. Okay, so here is Plessy versus a court case you really have got to know. All right. Plessy versus Ferguson, again, is one of your vocabulary terms that you've got to have. And in 1890, Louisiana had passed a law that required separate facilities on railroads, so separate facilities for blacks and separate ones for white. So the two groups didn't intermingle. Lots of people would protest this. Homer Plessy was about 1/8 black, which meant he met the legal definition to be black. but he could pass for white. He was on a white railroad car, but he was arrested for refusing to leave that car. This case will eventually make its way to the Supreme Court, and the court will rule that separate but equal is constitutional. Okay, so this is huge, and you've got to have this down somewhere, and you've got to commit this to memory. Plessy versus Ferguson, and the Supreme Court saying separate but equal is constitutional, is going to say Jim Crow laws and racial discrimination is legal according to the federal government. That means states can have separate but equal facilities. I want you to think to yourself, who's going in to check to make sure that those separate facilities are equal, that both of them have the same resources and supplies and equipment? Probably not anybody, which means black facilities are going to be far less up to par than the white facilities. They're not going to have nearly the nice, in schools, they won't have the nice desks and the textbooks. They may not even have a good standing building. Bathrooms, the plumbing may not work in the black facilities, where in the whites, they're probably maintained and kept up well. Okay. So here's kind of here's a newspaper article, and I want you to just kind of see this, and you can go back to your notes and look at this. And this is about Plessy versus Ferguson. It says, another Jim Crow car case. The arrest of a Negro traveler who persisted in riding with the white people. And it goes on to talk about Plessy being arrested and why he was arrested, and then this will eventually go to the Supreme Court. This is a primary source document that can help you understand what the times were like. Jim Crow laws and Plessy versus Ferguson. Okay, so since the Supreme Court upheld separate but equal, then segregation is legal, according to the federal government. This is not going to stop violence against blacks, and it's only going to, again, ensure the security of racism in the eyes of the law, meaning it's going to be legal to segregate blacks from whites. And then there's the development of the NAACP. Because of everything that is happening, there's going to be an organization that's going to come together and create itself so that they can fight for the rights of those that are being discriminated against. Spread violence and lynchings. People are going to create the NAACP. We need to look out for the benefit of everybody. Okay, and the fair and equal treatment of everybody. In 1909, the NAACP is going to be created by W.E.B. Du Bois and white supporters. Again, NAACP is a vocab term. This yellow you need to have in your notes. The goals of the NAACP are basically, it's very, very simplistic. Secure the rights for all people that are guaranteed under the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendment. The 13th meaning no slavery. The 14th meaning due process, and everybody should be treated equally under the law. And the 15th is male suffrage. All right? The NAACP is going to begin to challenge Jim Crow laws and lynchings in the courts, and they're going to be successful. Okay? And from 1896 to 1954, legal segregation is the standard until Brown versus the Board of Education comes about. Okay? But because of this, the conditions for blacks in the South are going to before they improve.